But whenever he worked alone.
Yeah.
He never had to work with anyone else, even though he was always with his brothers. He did his stuff alone.
They were television's favorite neighbors, the lovable bickering couple who always made audiences laugh. But behind the scenes of I Love Lucy, Fred and Ethel were anything but friendly. The actors who played them, William Frawley and Vivian Vance, reportedly hated each other, and the tension was so intense it almost tore the show apart. Before they were immortalized as Fred and Ethel Mertz, William Frawley and Vivian Vance lived vastly different lives, both shaped by hard knocks, deep ambition, and personal battles that would eventually fuel one of television's most infamous off-screen feuds. William Frawley was already a seasoned Hollywood actor by the time I Love Lucy came along. Born in 1887, he had spent decades in vaudeville, Broadway, and film, often typecast as the grumpy, blue-collar everyman. His humor was sharp, his delivery rough around the edges, and his personal demons, especially his battles with alcohol, were an open secret in the industry. When Desi Arnaz offered him the role of Fred Mertz, Frawley was nearly 65 years old and long past his peak as a movie actor. He saw I Love Lucy as his last shot at stability, and he grabbed it with both hands. Vivian Vance, on the other hand, was younger, refined, and fresh off years of stage success. She was trained in classical theater, admired for her versatility and comedic timing. At the time of casting, she was in her early 40s, making her 22 years younger than Frawley. When she learned he would play her husband, she reportedly recoiled, scoffing that no one would believe she was married to someone so much older, and, as she allegedly put it, looking like that. It was a careless comment, but one that Frawley never forgot. He may have been old school, but his pride was sharp, and Vivian's jab cut deep. Their tension began before a single scene was filmed. Frawley was outraged that his television wife had openly mocked his age and appearance, and he carried that resentment like a badge. From day one, he treated her with suspicion and disdain, seeing her as pretentious, snobby, and disrespectful. Vance, in turn, saw Frawley as a washed-up drunk clinging to his last paycheck. Their dynamic was cemented long before the cameras rolled, and there was no turning back. The network had hoped for natural chemistry, but what they got was raw hostility wrapped in professionalism. Somehow, that friction translated on-screen as lovable bickering. Audiences adored Fred and Ethel's sarcastic exchanges and playful jabs, never realizing the venom underneath. Frawley and Vance may have loathed each other, but they understood their roles, and they delivered every single time the red light turned on. But behind the applause and laughter, that first clash between egos would become the foundation of a feud that only got uglier with time. And while the public laughed at Fred and Ethel's arguments, the real battles were happening after the director yelled, "Cut." And it only got worse once Frawley's personal struggles began affecting the entire production. William Frawley's reputation for being difficult did not start with I Love Lucy. Long before he ever set foot on the sitcom's soundstage, Frawley was known throughout the industry as a heavy drinker with a short temper. His battles with alcohol had cost him roles in the past, and Desi Arnaz was well aware of the risks when he cast him as Fred Mertz. In fact, Arnaz had only one rule for Frawley: if he ever showed up to set drunk, he would be fired. Surprisingly, Frawley honored that agreement, but even sober, he could be a handful. Vivian Vance, on the other hand, came from the world of live theater, where professionalism and punctuality were non-negotiable. She prided herself on preparation and discipline, and she found Frawley's rough-edged behavior grating from the start. While he saw her as uptight and superior, she viewed him as lazy and coarse. The divide between their work ethics widened the rift between them, and it showed in nearly every interaction. One of the earliest and most damaging moments came when Vance reportedly lobbied for a younger actor to play her husband. She complained that Frawley looked more like her grandfather than her spouse, and even suggested that the age gap was hurting the show's believability. Though it was never confirmed whether these comments made it to the network, word certainly got back to Frawley, and he was livid. From then on, their on-set relationship became a quiet war of eye rolls, sarcastic barbs, and icy glares. Frawley would mutter insults insults under his breath. Vance would laugh just a little too hard at his mistakes. The tension was thick enough that even the crew noticed, and it often made rehearsals uncomfortable for everyone involved. Yet somehow, the final product on screen remained flawless, like two pros locking into character and masking their contempt with convincing chemistry. Desi Arnaz, the show's producer and co-star, found himself in a difficult position. He respected Frawley and admired his old Hollywood timing, but he also saw Vance as critical to the show's success. Rather than try to mend the relationship, he kept them in a delicate balance, never scheduling unnecessary rehearsals between them, never seating them together at events, and keeping their scenes efficient and focused. Arnaz knew they would never be friends. His goal was simple: keep the peace just long enough to get the shot. For all her frustration, Vance never allowed herself to lash out publicly. She kept her complaints confined to private conversations and inner-circle confidants. But the cracks were always there. One makeup artist recalled how Vance would finish a scene with Frawley, storm off set, and whisper, "I deserve an Emmy just for putting up with him." And Frawley, in turn, would loudly refer to her as that BH between takes, completely unconcerned with who might overhear. Still, neither actor walked away. As much as they despised each other, they knew the show was a hit, and the money was too good to risk. So, the charade continued, episode after episode, season after season. But underneath the laughs, the bitterness kept growing, and the real nightmare began when they had to act like they actually liked each other. On screen, Fred and Ethel Mertz were a comedy dream team, sarcastic, playful, and oddly affectionate. But behind the camera, William Frawley and Vivian Vance could barely tolerate each other. That warm chemistry fans loved was an illusion, held together by sheer professionalism and an unspoken agreement. Get through the scene, then get as far away from each other as possible. Filming their scenes became a tightly controlled operation. Directors knew they had to limit rehearsal time and shoot quickly to avoid confrontation. Frawley and Vance rarely interacted off-camera and never rehearsed more than absolutely necessary. Scenes between just the two of them were shot fast and without room for improvisation. Neither wanted to spend one extra second in the other's presence. Crew members felt the tension constantly. Even after nailing a scene, the two would walk off in opposite directions without a word. The set would go quiet. At one point, a visiting director even joked that Fred and Ethel got along better than the actors behind them, and no one laughed. The hostility seeped into every corner of production. Vance avoided sitting near Frawley during table reads. He, in turn, insulted her voice and delivery within earshot. When Vance was once asked to act sweet toward him in a scene, she reportedly asked, "Do we really expect people to buy this?" Frawley, overhearing her, fired back, "They've bought worse from you." Despite the constant strain, viewers never picked up on the feud. Their timing, delivery, and banter made Fred and Ethel a highlight of the show. Fans believed the connection was real, which only frustrated Vance more. She saw herself carrying their scenes while he got credit for the chemistry. Frawley, meanwhile, believed she was trying to outshine him. The resentment only deepened. There were moments when it boiled over. Blocking sessions sometimes turned into shouting matches, with accusations of upstaging and laziness flying back and forth. Desi Arnaz had to personally step in and remind them that their jobs depended on putting the show first. Somehow, they always did. Their ability to perform under pressure was remarkable. Even as the feud wore them down, neither let it affect what ended up on screen. But that professionalism came at a cost. Pretending to care for someone they loathed took a toll. The tension was always simmering, even if the audience never saw it. And those who had to manage the fallout, including Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz, were the ones who suffered the most behind the scenes, because keeping Fred and Ethel together meant constant damage control from the top. Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz were not just the stars of I Love Lucy, they were the engine behind it. As producers and co-creators, they carried the pressure of keeping the show running smoothly, which included managing the constant behind-the-scenes tension between William Frawley and Vivian Vance. It was a delicate balancing act that tested even their control over the most successful show on television. Desi Arnaz saw William Frawley as a reliable professional, despite his reputation for drinking. breathtaking. Frawley showed up on time, knew his lines, and hit every mark. Arnaz admired that, and even with pressure from CBS executives, he defended Frawley with one rule: if Frawley ever came to work drunk, he was out. He never did. Lucille Ball, meanwhile, was much closer to Vivian Vance. The two bonded early and shared genuine friendship. Ball respected Vance's theater background and depended on her comedic instincts to bring emotional depth to the show. While she remained outwardly neutral during cast disputes, her sympathies leaned toward Vance. Still, she remained publicly supportive of Frawley, knowing the show's success depended on everyone playing their part. Managing the feud meant making constant adjustments. Scenes between Fred and Ethel were written carefully to avoid unnecessary closeness. Directors learned to limit rehearsals between the two, knowing prolonged contact only invited drama. Even affectionate moments had to be filmed quickly, with minimal interaction outside of what was needed on camera. Behind closed doors, Lucille and Desi took on the role of silent referees. Studio executives were aware of the friction, but the couple worked hard to keep the press from catching on. There were no interviews addressing the feud, no backstage gossip allowed to slip through. I Love Lucy was too valuable to let personal conflicts taint its image. And yet, despite everything, Desi never considered replacing either actor. He once quipped that the day Fred and Ethel actually got along would be the end of the show. That joke hit close to home. Their real-life dislike mirrored their on-screen dynamic: grumpy, sarcastic, occasionally affectionate. It was art imitating life, but with the bitterness filtered out for the audience. One telling story came from a celebratory dinner for the show's milestone episode. Frawley and Vance arrived separately, avoided speaking, and reportedly rolled their eyes when a toast was made in their honor. It was a small but clear sign. The feud was permanent, no matter how well they performed together. Lucille and Desi held things together for as long as they could, but even they could not stop what came next: a spin-off offer from CBS that would push the divide past the point of no return. And when the network offered Fred and Ethel their own show, the fallout was immediate. By the mid-1950s, I Love Lucy had become a cultural phenomenon. Its ratings were unmatched, its stars beloved, and its supporting characters, Fred and Ethel Mertz, had carved out their own fan base. So when CBS floated the idea of a spin-off starring just the Mertzes, the network thought it was a sure thing. But behind the scenes, the proposal lit a fuse that blew the feud wide open. CBS believed Fred and Ethel could carry their own sitcom, with storylines centered around their marriage, misadventures, and maybe even a new set of neighbors. The pitch was bold, executives were reportedly enthusiastic, and William Frawley jumped at the opportunity. For him, it meant more money, more spotlight, and a chance to prove he was more than just a supporting player. He was all in, until he learned who was not. Vivian Vance flatly refused. According to multiple sources, Vance did not even consider the offer. The thought of working with Frawley on a show where they would be the main focus was, in her words, unbearable. She made it clear she would never agree to a project that forced her into more scenes with a man she actively despised. Whether she feared being typecast or just could not stomach more time with Frawley, her answer was a hard no. Frawley was furious. He had already begun to envision the show's success. In his mind, Vance was sabotaging both their futures out of spite. He accused her of selfishness, unprofessionalism, and arrogance. Their already icy relationship turned venomous. From that point on, even polite civility disappeared. Vance stopped hiding her disdain. Frawley, in turn, doubled down on the insults, calling her names behind her back, and sometimes to her face. The fallout was immediate. The spin-off was dead before it ever left the ground. CBS backed off. Lucy and Desi, reportedly relieved to avoid more drama, chose not to push it. And for Vance and Frawley, the offer marked a turning point. There would be no reconciliation, no middle ground, and no future collaboration. If there had ever been a chance to mend things, it ended the moment she turned down that show. The irony was cruel. Audiences thought Fred and Ethel were inseparable. In reality, one of them was willing to walk away from fame and fortune just to avoid the other. The bitterness had gone beyond mere dislike. It was now career-defining. And yet, to the public, none of this was visible. Because the studio had one goal: keep the feud buried. To television audiences, Fred and Ethel Mertz were comedy gold, relatable, dependable, and effortlessly funny. Their chemistry was so believable that most viewers assumed William Frawley and Vivian Vance had just as much camaraderie off-screen. But behind that illusion was a carefully maintained facade, orchestrated by publicists and producers who worked hard to hide the truth. The two actors deeply despised each other. In the 1950s, Hollywood, image was everything. Studios had entire departments devoted to keeping scandals out of the press. Any signs of tension between cast members were buried under cheerful press releases, light-hearted interviews, and perfectly posed cast photos. Vance and Frawley played along. At events, they smiled on cue. During interviews, they answered questions diplomatically. But once the cameras stopped flashing, they avoided each other like the plague. Vivian Vance, shaped by her disciplined theater background, knew better than to complain publicly. She confided in close friends, but never let her grievances go public, aware that one misstep could cost her future roles. William Frawley, though more outspoken in private, also understood the unspoken rule: never let the public know what was really going on. Still, he made his feelings known to those on set, mocking Vance's voice, her looks, even her acting. Crew members recalled hearing him mutter insults under his breath while watching her rehearse. The studio, aware of their animosity, made quiet adjustments to keep peace. Promo tours were planned, so they rarely traveled together. At award shows, they were seated far apart. Even in group interviews, Lucy and Desi were strategically placed between them. When whispers of conflict surfaced, they were quickly shut down or dismissed as jokes. And somehow, through all the friction, the show never suffered. Week after week, viewers watched Fred and Ethel laugh, argue, and support each other as if nothing were wrong. The performances were seamless, the tension invisible to the audience, but that is what makes their story so fascinating. Everything people loved about Fred and Ethel was built on two people faking it with everything they had. It was not affection that kept their scenes sharp, it was professionalism and a shared commitment to the show's success. And they pulled it off so well that even decades later, many fans still cannot believe the truth. But the illusion only lasted as long as the cameras rolled. Off-screen, the divide between them never healed, and once the show ended, the mask came off. When I Love Lucy came to an end, William Frawley and Vivian Vance finally got what they had longed for: distance from each other. But time did not heal anything. If anything, their resentment only hardened with age, spilling into later interviews and leaving no doubt that their hatred had survived long past the final curtain. Frawley was the first to speak publicly, though not kindly. When asked about Vance, he never missed a chance to insult her, calling her ungrateful and impossible to work with. He often joked that if she died, he would send flowers to celebrate. He meant it. His bitterness was not performative, it was personal. For Frawley, Vance had not just insulted him, she had ruined what could have been the biggest opportunity of his later career. Vance, for her part, was only slightly more diplomatic, but she made no secret of her contempt. In interviews, she refused to speak Frawley's name, referring to him only as "that man" or "my so-called husband." In one moment of brutal honesty, she said working with him was the hardest part of her career. When Frawley died in 1966, she reportedly celebrated with champagne. Whether that is rumor or fact, it was consistent with how people around her remembered her feelings. There was no reconciliation, no late-in-life phone call, no private truce. Their feud remained untouched and unresolved, preserved like the very episodes they once filmed together. While Lucille Ball stayed close with both actors individually, even she could never get them in the same room again after the show ended. The animosity had roots too deep to be pulled. What is most striking is how differently the two were remembered. Frawley died before the era of reboots, retrospectives, and sitcom nostalgia. Vance, however, lived long enough to see I Love Lucy cemented as a cultural icon. She gave a few interviews in her later years, often fondly remembering Lucy, but never Fred. She made sure that history remembered who the problem was. In the end, the performances lived on, while the people behind them drifted apart for good. Their final years confirmed what insiders had known all along. The laughs were scripted, but the hate was real. And even now, long after both are gone, fans are still learning the truth behind the laughter. Decades after I Love Lucy ended, the show remains a classic, still watched, quoted, and adored by new generations. Fred and Ethel Mertz continue to make audiences laugh, their sarcastic banter and offbeat affection frozen in time. But knowing the truth behind the scenes changes everything. What once looked like playful teasing now feels like veiled hostility. The sideways glances, the flat tones, even the moments of silence between lines. Suddenly, they do not feel like acting anymore. And that is what makes this story so compelling. The performances were brilliant, but they were fueled by something very real: mutual resentment, buried just below the surface. Vivian Vance and William Frawley proved that even the most toxic working relationship can produce magic when the cameras roll. But it came at a cost. Neither ever softened their stance. Neither tried to repair what was broken. They gave the world unforgettable television, while privately nursing a grudge that never died. Today, fans rewatch I Love Lucy with new eyes. They still laugh at Fred and Ethel, but now, many also wonder what it must have been like to deliver those lines while despising the person standing just inches away. It adds a new layer, darker, more complex, and impossible to ignore. This was more than just a feud. It was a battle hidden in plain sight, performed for an audience who never knew what they were really watching. Because behind every laugh was a lie.